I used your college fund for Emma's wedding. My mother said it the way someone might mention they'd borrowed a sweater without asking, casual and dismissive, as if $45,000 was nothing more than loose change she'd found between couch cushions. I stood in our kitchen holding the bank statement I'd finally received in the mail, the one I'd been waiting for since turning 22 3 weeks earlier. The statement that should have shown the full balance my father had set aside for my education before he died of cancer 7 years ago. Instead, it showed a balance of $0.00. You what? I heard my voice crack on the second word, felt my hands beginning to shake as I gripped the paper hard enough to crumple the edges. My mother didn't even look up from her phone, where she was scrolling through what I could see were photos of flower arrangements, her face showing mild annoyance at my interruption rather than any hint of guilt or remorse. Emma's wedding is next month, Sarah, and we needed to make sure it was perfect. You understand? It's a once-in-a-lifetime event. She said this as if it explained everything, as if the logic was so obvious that my confusion was the unreasonable part of this equation. That was my college fund, Dad's college fund, for Columbia. I was trying to keep my voice steady but failing, the words coming out strangled and desperate. He set that money aside specifically for my education. You know I was accepted. You know I was supposed to start in January. My mother finally looked up, and the expression on her face was one I'd seen countless times throughout my 22 years, a mixture of impatience and disappointment that I wasn't simply going along with whatever she'd decided was best. You can always go to community college, Sarah. You've been doing fine there for the past 2 years anyway. Emma only gets married once, and Blake's family has expectations. The venue alone was $30,000. She said this as if I should be proud, as if I should be grateful to have contributed to my older sister's perfect day. Besides, you're being dramatic. Education is education. You'll figure something out. You always do. That last phrase hit me like a physical blow because I realized what it really meant. I always figured things out because I'd never had another choice. I'd always been the one expected to be flexible, to understand, to sacrifice, to make do with less, while Emma got everything she wanted precisely when she wanted it. My sister appeared in the doorway then, 26 years old, and radiant in the way people are when life has always bent in their favor, holding fabric swatches and looking irritated. Mom, I need you to help me decide between the blush and the champagne napkins. Oh, Sarah, you're still coming to the dress fitting on Saturday, right? We need to make sure your bridesmaid dress actually fits this time. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click. But for me, it means a lot. Standing in that kitchen with the empty bank statement in my hands, I felt the weight of 22 years of being second best crash down on me all at once, and suddenly I could see the pattern so clearly it was almost physically painful. The endless repetition of moments where I had been overlooked, forgotten, dismissed as less important than Emma's needs and wants and dreams. I remembered being 17 years old, standing on the stage at Jefferson High School as class valedictorian, scanning the audience for my mother's face during the most important speech of my young life, the culmination of 4 years of perfect grades and sleepless nights and scholarship applications, only to find her seat empty because Emma had needed help choosing bridesmaid dresses for her friend's wedding that same afternoon. My mother had promised she would make it, had sworn she wouldn't miss it. But when I came home still wearing my honor cords, she was sitting at the kitchen table with Emma surrounded by fabric swatches and didn't even ask how the ceremony went. Then there was my 16th birthday, the one that should have been special, the one where I'd hoped maybe we could do something together as a family for once. But Emma had gotten engaged 2 days earlier, and suddenly my birthday dinner was canceled because we needed to have an impromptu engagement celebration instead. I spent my 16th birthday watching my mother fawn over Emma's ring, while my own gifts sat forgotten in a bag in the hallway, eventually opened 3 days later with no ceremony and barely an acknowledgement. I had worked 2 jobs all through my community college years, pulling double shifts at the campus library and weekend mornings at a coffee shop near our house, saving every possible dollar while watching Emma get handed a brand new Honda Civic for her 24th birthday, given to her simply because she mentioned she didn't like her old car anymore. My mother had never even suggested helping with my tuition or books, or the ancient Toyota I'd bought with my own money for $800 that broke down twice a semester. The college fund had been my secret hope, the one thing I'd kept private and protected, knowing it was managed by Richard Morrison, my father's best friend, and the lawyer who had handled his estate after he died when I was 15. I had thought it was safe, thought that at least this one thing my father had left for me would remain untouched, would be waiting for me when I turned 22, just as he had planned. I had even received my acceptance letter from Columbia 3 months ago, had been planning for the spring semester start date, had filled out all the paperwork and submitted my enrollment deposit using money from my savings, believing that the college fund would cover tuition and living expenses once it became accessible. But my mother had somehow found a way to access it, had exploited some loophole or emergency clause that Richard must not have anticipated, and now it was gone, spent on flowers and a venue and a dress for Emma's perfect day. I spent that night lying in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, while the walls seemed to close in around me, my mind racing through every possible solution and finding none that didn't involve begging my mother to somehow return money that was already spent, or giving up on Columbia entirely and accepting that community college was going to be the extent of my educational future. The acceptance letter was still pinned to my bulletin board, the Columbia University insignia at the top, representing everything I'd worked toward for years. And now it felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of how close I'd come to escaping, only to be pulled back down by the same family dynamics that had defined my entire life. I had already submitted my enrollment deposit of $1,500, had already been assigned a student ID number, had already started planning which classes I would take in the spring semester when the journalism program began, and now I would have to email the admissions office and explain that I couldn't attend after all because my mother had stolen my tuition money to pay for my sister's wedding flowers. The humiliation of that explanation was almost worse than the loss itself. The next morning, my mother acted as if nothing significant had happened, making coffee in the kitchen and asking me cheerfully if I could pick up Emma's altered veil from the seamstress on Thursday, since she would be busy with the caterer, and I realized she genuinely did not understand the magnitude of what she'd done, or perhaps more accurately she understood, but simply didn't care, because Emma's happiness had always mattered more than mine. "I need you to be reasonable about this, Sarah," she said when I didn't immediately respond to her request about the veil, her voice taking on that edge of irritation I knew so well. "I know you're disappointed, but family means making sacrifices for each other. Emma would do the same for you." But we both knew that was a lie. Emma had never sacrificed anything for anyone in her entire life, had never been asked to, had floated through her 26 years on earth cushioned by our mother's unwavering devotion and financial support while I had scraped and struggled for every single thing I'd ever achieved. "Also, we're going to need you to contribute about $500 toward the bridesmaid luncheon," my mother continued, scrolling through her phone as if she hadn't just asked me for more money after taking $45,000 that wasn't hers. "Emma wants to do it at that nice restaurant downtown, and it's running a bit more expensive than we anticipated. You can manage that, can't you? You've been working all those extra shifts." I felt something crack inside me then, some fundamental belief that if I just tried hard enough or was patient enough or understanding enough, my mother would eventually see me clearly and value me the way she valued Emma. And I realized with devastating clarity that it would never happen, that I could achieve every possible success, and it would never be enough to earn the kind of unconditional love and support she gave my sister without hesitation. I called Richard Morrison the next afternoon from my car in the parking lot of the grocery store where I'd told my mother I was going, needing somewhere private where she wouldn't overhear. And when he answered on the second ring, his familiar warm voice immediately made my throat tighten with emotion, because he had been my father's closest friend since college, and he was one of the few people left in my life who remembered what my father had been like, and who treated me with genuine kindness. "Sarah, it's good to hear from you," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice that faded quickly when I told him what my mother had done. My words tumbling out in a rush as I explained about the empty account and the wedding and Columbia and how everything I'd planned for was disappearing. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and when Richard finally spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "She used the medical emergency clause," he said, and I could hear him moving papers around in what I assumed was his office. "I built that into the trust at your father's request, in case you ever needed emergency surgery or treatment, something catastrophic that couldn't wait. Your mother apparently claimed she needed the funds immediately for a medical situation, and provided falsified documentation that I'm only now seeing was never properly verified by the bank." The betrayal of it was staggering, that my mother had not only taken the money but had lied to do it, had manufactured a fake emergency to access funds that were supposed to be protected, and I felt tears starting to slide down my face as I sat there in my car, surrounded by people loading groceries into their trunks and living their normal lives while mine fell apart. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I should have built in more safeguards. Your father trusted me to protect this for you, and I failed." But then Richard's voice changed, took on a different tone that made me sit up straighter and wipe my eyes. "However, there's something your mother doesn't know about. Something your father set up separately through a different firm specifically because he worried about this exact scenario." My heart started beating faster as Richard explained that my father had created a secondary trust that had matured on my 22nd birthday 3 months ago, completely separate from the college fund, managed by a firm in Boston that my mother had no knowledge of and no access to. "It's $78,000, Sarah. Your father intended it as a graduate school fund, something for your future that would remain untouched and protected. He made me promise not to tell you about it until after the first trust was disbursed, because he wanted you to have the college fund first, and know this was waiting for later, but given what's happened, you need to know now." Richard paused, and I could hear the emotion in his voice when he continued. "Your father also left letters for you, Sarah. He wrote them during his last months and asked me to give them to you when you accessed this trust. He knew, sweetheart. He saw how your mother treated you differently than Emma, and he wanted to make sure you'd be okay." I drove to Richard's office the following morning to pick up the letters my father had written, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as I thought about reading words he'd written when I was only 15 years old, back when he was dying and I was still young enough to believe that losing him was the worst thing that could ever happen to me, not understanding that his death would leave me unprotected in a family that had never truly valued me the way he had. Richard handed me a manila envelope that had my name written across the front in my father's familiar handwriting, the letters slightly shaky from the illness that had been consuming him during those final months. And I had to sit down in Richard's office chair because my legs suddenly felt too weak to support me. "Take your time," Richard said gently, and he left me alone in his conference room with the envelope and a box of tissues that I would need before I was finished. There were 3 letters inside, each dated from the last 6 months of my father's life. And I started with the earliest one dated March 2015, my hands trembling as I unfolded the paper and saw my father's words reaching across 7 years to speak to me. "My dearest Sarah," it began, and I could hear his voice in my head, as clearly as if he were sitting beside me, that warm, steady voice that had always made me feel safe and seen. "I'm writing this because I need you to know some things that I might not have the strength to say out loud as this illness progresses, and because I'm worried about what will happen to you after I'm gone." He wrote about noticing how my mother treated Emma and me differently, how Emma got praise for mediocre achievements, while my exceptional accomplishments were barely acknowledged, how I was expected to be understanding and flexible, while Emma's needs always came first, and seeing it written out in his careful handwriting made something break open inside my chest, because someone had seen it. Someone had noticed that I was being erased and diminished, and that someone was my father, who had loved me enough to try to protect me even after his death. Your mother loves you, but she has a blind spot when it comes to Emma that I've never been able to help her see past, and I'm afraid that without me there to advocate for you, that imbalance will only grow worse, he wrote, and I was crying now, tears dropping onto the paper as I read. I've set up funds that she cannot access because I need to know that you'll have resources to build the life you deserve, to pursue your dreams without having to beg for support that should be freely given. You are brilliant and strong and capable of extraordinary things, Sarah. And I need you to believe that even when the people around you fail to see it. The second letter contained specific instructions about the trust fund and his wishes for how I should use it, emphasizing that this money was for my dreams alone and that I should never feel guilty for protecting it or for choosing my own future over family obligations that were unfairly placed on my shoulders. The third letter was shorter, written in handwriting that was barely legible, clearly composed during his final days, and it simply said, "Remember that your worth is not determined by your mother's ability to recognize it. I see you, Sarah. I have always seen you. Make me proud by seeing yourself clearly too, by building a life that honors your gifts and your strength. You owe nothing to people who choose not to value you. Be free, my darling girl. Be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you." I walked back into my mother's house that afternoon after leaving Richard's office with my father's letters carefully folded in my purse, and my mind racing with possibilities I hadn't dared to imagine just 24 hours earlier. And when my mother looked up from the kitchen table where she was addressing wedding invitations with Emma sitting beside her scrolling through her phone, I saw her register my presence with barely a flicker of acknowledgement before returning to her careful calligraphy. "You're back," my mother said without looking up again. "Emma needs you to drive to the florist tomorrow to approve the centerpiece changes, and we need you to pick up her dress from the final alterations on Wednesday." I stood there in the doorway watching them, these two people who shared my blood but had never truly seen me, and I made a decision in that moment that felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air, trusting that I would find solid ground on the other side. "Of course," I said quietly, my voice steady and compliant in a way that made my mother finally glance up at me with something like satisfaction in her eyes. "Whatever you need." Emma looked up from her phone then, her perfectly made-up face showing mild surprise that I wasn't arguing or crying or making things difficult the way I apparently always did in her version of our family story. "Really? You're going to be reasonable about this?" she asked. And there was something in her tone that suggested she'd expected me to fight harder, to make my pain more visible so she could feel justified in dismissing it. "It's your wedding," I said, and I even managed a small smile that didn't reach my eyes, but apparently convinced them both that I had accepted my place in the family hierarchy, had finally understood that my dreams were less important than Emma's celebrations. "I want you to be happy." What I didn't tell them was that I had spent an hour on the phone with Columbia's admissions office that morning, confirming my enrollment for the spring semester and wiring my deposit from the trust fund account Richard had helped me access, or that I had already begun searching for apartments in New York within my careful budget, or that I was planning exactly how I would extract myself from their lives completely in a way that would leave no doubt about why I was leaving. Over the next 3 days, I became the perfect daughter and sister, agreeable and helpful and quietly present in all the ways they had always wanted me to be when it suited their needs, and I watched as they both relaxed into their familiar patterns of treating me as somewhere between a servant and an afterthought, never once questioning why I had stopped fighting or what my sudden compliance might mean. Emma had me running errands across the city, picking up wedding favors and confirming vendor deliveries and addressing envelopes until my hand cramped, and each time she thanked me with that casual dismissiveness that suggested my time and effort were simply what she was owed. I felt my resolve harden into something unbreakable. My mother sent me to the bank to deposit checks from wedding guests, apparently not finding any irony in having me handle money for Emma's wedding when she had stolen my entire future to pay for it, and I went without complaint, letting her believe I had been broken down into acceptance when in reality, I was building myself back up into someone strong enough to walk away. I kept working both my jobs, the morning shift at the campus bookstore, and the evening remote work doing data entry for a medical billing company, and I added every paycheck to my savings account, while my mother and Emma assumed I was just barely scraping by the way I always had, never imagining that I was building a foundation for a life they knew nothing about. 2 weeks before Emma's wedding, I stood in the bridal boutique's fitting room watching my sister examine herself in the three-way mirror while wearing a dress that cost more than most people's cars, and I knew with absolute certainty that my mother had spent at least $63,000 total on this wedding. The $45,000 she had stolen from my college fund, combined with money she'd borrowed from credit cards and taken out in personal loans that she would probably never be able to repay on her administrative assistant's salary. The venue was the Ashford Estate, the most expensive wedding location within 100 miles, with its sprawling gardens and ballroom that could accommodate 300 guests with crystal chandeliers and marble floors, and Emma had insisted on having the ceremony there despite the astronomical cost, because two of her co-workers had gotten married at less impressive places, and she needed to outdo them in every possible way. "Sarah, you're slouching again," Emma said without turning away from her reflection, her voice carrying that particular tone of criticism disguised as concern that she had perfected over the years. "Stand up straight, you're making the bridesmaid dresses look frumpy." I straightened automatically, catching sight of myself in the mirror behind her, wearing the pale pink bridesmaid dress that Emma had chosen specifically because she said the color washed me out and would make her look more radiant by comparison. Something she had actually said out loud to the sales associate while I stood right there, as if I were a decorative object without feelings or ears. My mother was sitting on the velvet couch in the corner, scrolling through her phone, coordinating with the florist about some last-minute change to the centerpieces that Emma had decided was absolutely necessary, and she looked up then with that expression of pride and adoration she reserved exclusively for my sister. "You look absolutely stunning, Emma," my mother said, her voice warm with genuine emotion. "Blake is going to cry when he sees you walking down that aisle." Emma smiled at her reflection, adjusting the bodice of her dress, and then she glanced at me with an expression that managed to be both pitying and contemptuous. "At least one of us figured out how to launch successfully," she said, and my mother actually laughed as if this were a clever observation, rather than a cruel dismissal of the fact that I was living at home and working two jobs because they had stolen my future. "Sarah's still figuring things out," my mother said in that dismissive tone that suggested my 22 years of existence were just an extended phase of confused adolescence. "Not everyone can land on their feet the way you did, Emma, with your marketing position and your wonderful fiancé." The marketing position that my mother's friend had given Emma as a favor, where Emma spent most of her day planning her wedding instead of actually working, and the wonderful fiancé whose family's money was probably the primary attraction, though I would never say that out loud because I had learned long ago that speaking uncomfortable truths about Emma only resulted in me being painted as jealous and bitter. I remained quiet, my face carefully neutral, while inside I was thinking about the lease I had signed 3 days earlier for a tiny studio apartment in Washington Heights, and about the confirmation email from Columbia sitting in my inbox, and about the moving company I had scheduled to pick up my belongings exactly 3 days after this absurdly expensive wedding that had been built on the ruins of my stolen dreams. The rehearsal dinner was held at Marcello's, an upscale Italian restaurant downtown, with exposed brick walls and candlelit tables where the prix menu cost $90 per person. And I sat at the long table watching Emma hold court in her rehearsal dress, a white lace cocktail number that had cost more than my monthly paycheck, while Blake's family mingled with our sparse collection of relatives and my mother's friends, who had gathered to celebrate the eve of this wedding that had been purchased with my stolen future. Blake's parents were exactly what I had expected. His father, Gerald, a recently retired Superior Court judge with silver hair and an air of quiet authority. His mother, Patricia, a literature professor at the State University with elegant glasses and the kind of sharp intelligence that showed in her observant eyes. And his younger sister, Kate, who was closer to my age and had been kind to me during the few wedding events where we'd crossed paths, asking questions about my life that suggested she actually cared about the answers, unlike my own family, who had never bothered to learn what I dreamed about or hoped for beyond their immediate need for my labor. The dinner progressed through multiple courses, while Emma made sure every moment centered on her, telling stories about how Blake had proposed during a weekend trip to Napa Valley, and how she had known immediately that he was the one, because he understood her need for beautiful things and experiences that matched her vision of the life she deserved. And I watched Blake's parents exchange glances that I couldn't quite read, subtle communications between two people who had been married long enough to speak without words. When the main course was cleared and the servers brought out champagne for toasts, Emma stood up first, even though traditionally the maid of honor was supposed to speak at the rehearsal dinner. But Emma had never been someone who followed traditions that didn't serve her immediate desires, and she tapped her glass with her fork until the conversations died down and everyone turned their attention to her glowing face. "I just want to thank everyone for being here to celebrate with Blake and me," she began, her voice taking on that performative sweetness that I had learned to recognize as the precursor to cruelty disguised as humor. "And I especially want to thank my amazing mother who sacrificed so much to make tomorrow absolutely perfect." My mother beamed from her seat, raising her glass toward Emma with tears already forming in her eyes. "Mom gave up Sarah's little college fund to help pay for this wedding," Emma continued, and I felt my entire body go still as every eye in the room suddenly shifted toward me. "And honestly, I think it was put to much better use this way since Sarah's still figuring things out anyway, still living at home and working those retail jobs, while I'm starting this incredible new chapter of my life." There was uncomfortable laughter from some of the guests, the kind of nervous sound people make when they're not sure if they should be amused or appalled, and I saw Patricia's face tighten with what looked like genuine shock, while Gerald's expression went completely neutral in the way I imagined he had perfected during years on the bench listening to testimony. "Emma's wedding is once in a lifetime," my mother added, standing up herself now as if this were a planned comedy routine. "And Sarah can always go to community college later when she finally decides what she wants to do with herself." My hands were gripping my napkin under the table so tightly that I could feel my nails cutting into my palms through the fabric, but I kept my face completely composed, even managing a small smile that I knew didn't reach my eyes, while inside I was burning with a rage so pure and focused that it felt like it might consume me from the inside out. Kate was staring at Emma and my mother with unconcealed horror, and I saw her lean toward her father to whisper something that made his jaw tighten, while Blake himself looked uncomfortable but said nothing to contradict or correct his bride-to-be, apparently willing to let this moment of public humiliation pass without comment, because confronting Emma would mean making a scene and disrupting the perfect wedding weekend atmosphere. This was the final straw, the moment when whatever small part of me that had still hoped for some kind of reconciliation or understanding died completely, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would not only cut them out of my life after tomorrow, but that I would make sure everyone understood exactly why, that I would speak my truth in a way that left no room for misinterpretation or revision. The wedding day arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed cosmically unfair given what the day represented. Clear blue skies and gentle sunshine that made the Ashford Estates gardens look like something from a fantasy. And I woke up at 5 in the morning in my childhood bedroom, knowing that this was one of the last times I would sleep in this house, that in 3 days I would be gone forever, and these people who called themselves my family would become nothing more than painful memories I would spend years processing in therapy. The bridesmaids were expected at the venue by 8 for hair and makeup, so I dressed in comfortable clothes and drove to the estate in my old Honda that Emma had once described as an embarrassment, And when I arrived, the entire place was already a flurry of activity, with wedding coordinators directing vendors and florists, arranging elaborate displays of white roses and peonies that probably cost more per arrangement than I made in a week at either of my jobs. The bridal suite was on the second floor of the estate's main house, a large room with tall windows and antique furniture where Emma sat in a silk robe holding court while three different stylists worked on her hair and makeup, and my mother was already there wearing her mother of the bride dress, a champagne-colored gown that she had spent weeks finding, looking at Emma with such pure adoration and pride that I had to look away because I knew I would never see that expression directed at me. I performed my bridesmaid duties perfectly, sitting still while someone styled my hair into soft curls and applied makeup that Emma had specifically requested be subtle so that none of the bridesmaids would draw attention from her. And I smiled and nodded and fetched things when asked and listened to Emma issue commands like I was hired help rather than her sister. When Emma was finally dressed in her gown, a custom designer creation with intricate beadwork and a cathedral train that had cost $17,000, according to the invoice I had seen on the kitchen counter at home, my mother actually started crying while telling her how beautiful she looked, how this was the happiest day of her life, how proud she was of the woman Emma had become. Then my mother pulled a small velvet box from her purse and opened it to reveal a diamond bracelet, an antique piece that had belonged to our paternal grandmother, and she fastened it around Emma's wrist while saying it should go to the daughter who had made something of herself, who had found a good man and was starting a real family. And Emma beamed while I stood there in my pale pink bridesmaid dress that washed out my complexion exactly as intended, and felt absolutely nothing except cold certainty about what I was going to do in a few hours. My mother never even glanced at me during this exchange, never acknowledged that family heirlooms should perhaps be shared between daughters. And when I caught my reflection in the full-length mirror, I barely recognized myself, because I had become so practiced at making my face a blank mask that hid everything happening underneath. "You'll understand when you accomplish something worth celebrating, Sarah," my mother said then, finally looking at me with an expression that managed to be both pitying and dismissive. And I smiled and nodded and said nothing while thinking about the acceptance letter from Columbia and the apartment lease and the life I had built in secret while they assumed I was defeated and compliant. And I knew that in just a few hours, everyone in that reception hall would understand exactly what I had accomplished, despite every obstacle they had placed in my path. The ceremony itself was beautiful in the way that $63,000 can make anything beautiful, held in the estate's garden pavilion, where white chiffon draped from the ceiling and crystal chandeliers hung from wooden beams. And 200 guests sat in neat rows on white chairs, with silk cushions watching Emma glide down the aisle on our mother's arm, while a string quartet played, and I stood at the altar in my pale pink dress, holding a bouquet of roses that matched the elaborate arrangements on every surface. And I watched Blake's face as he saw his bride, and thought about how he had no idea what kind of family he was marrying into, what kind of woman he had chosen who could benefit from theft and feel nothing but entitled satisfaction. The reception moved into the estate's grand ballroom, where round tables were decorated with towering centerpieces, and the place settings included 3 different forks and wine glasses that caught the light from more chandeliers. And I found my assigned seat at table 17 near the back of the room, far from the head table where Emma and Blake sat with the wedding party, that didn't include me despite being her sister, far from table 2 where my mother held court with her friends, even far from the tables where extended relatives I barely knew had been given priority placement, because apparently being an aunt twice removed who sent Christmas cards warranted better treatment than being the bride's sister. I sat with some of Blake's distant cousins and a few college friends of Emma's who didn't know me. And I was fine with this placement, actually preferred it because it gave me a clear view of the entire room and let me observe without being observed, let me watch as dinner was served and speeches were made, and my mother stood up to toast Emma with tears streaming down her face while talking about the joy of watching her daughter find true love and build a beautiful life. During the dinner service, Emma caught my eye from the head table, and I saw her whisper something to my mother, who then turned to look at me with that expression I knew so well. And then my mother stood up again, even though the formal toasts were supposed to be finished, and tapped her glass until the room quieted, and said she wanted to add one more thing about how proud she was that Emma had turned out so well, despite the challenges of growing up with limited resources, and how Sarah was still finding her way, but they had high hopes that eventually I would figure out what I wanted to do with my uncertain future. And the room filled with that same uncomfortable laughter from the rehearsal dinner, while Blake's parents looked increasingly disturbed, and Kate, who was seated at table 5, caught my eye with an expression of genuine sympathy and mouthed something that looked like, "I'm sorry." I smiled and raised my glass in a mock toast to my own humiliation, while inside I felt nothing but calm certainty. And I noticed Kate get up from her table and make her way over to mine, sliding into the empty chair beside me, and saying quietly that my family was unbelievably cruel and asking if I was okay. And I told her honestly that I was better than okay, that I was exactly where I needed to be. And she looked at me with confusion, but also respect, and said that if I ever needed anything, a friend or just someone to talk to, she wanted me to know that not everyone in this room thought it was acceptable to treat family the way mine treated me. The dinner plates had been cleared, and the formal toasts were finished, and the DJ was starting to play soft background music, while guests mingled and laughed and celebrated my sister's perfect day, and I sat at table 17 watching it all with a strange sense of detachment, knowing that everything was about to change, that in the next few minutes I would detonate the truth like a bomb in the middle of all this expensive beauty, and there would be no taking it back. I stood up slowly and walked toward the DJ booth, where a young guy with headphones around his neck was sorting through music requests, and I leaned in close and said quietly that I wanted to make a toast to my sister, that I needed the microphone for just a few minutes, and he looked uncertain, but then shrugged and handed me the wireless mic while saying to keep it brief because they were supposed to start the dancing soon. I held the microphone in my hand and felt its weight, and thought about my father and his letters, and the $45,000 that should have been my future, and the life I had built in secret while they assumed I was broken. And I walked to the center of the dance floor and tapped the microphone twice so the sound system gave two soft thumps that made people turn to look. "I just wanted to say a few words about my sister Emma," I began, and my voice came out steady and clear through the speakers, and I saw my mother's face at table 2 register surprise, but then something like pleased satisfaction, because she probably thought I was finally going to show proper appreciation and play my role as the lesser daughter who knew her place. "Growing up with Emma was an education in what it means to be family," I continued, and people were settling back into their seats now, giving me their attention, and Emma at the head table was smiling that gracious bride smile while Blake held her hand. I learned so much from watching how our mother loved her, how she prioritized Emma's needs and dreams, how nothing was too expensive or too much trouble when it came to making Emma happy. I paused and saw my mother nodding along and several guests smiling because this sounded like a typical sentimental sister speech, but Kate at table 5 was watching me with an expression that suggested she sensed something underneath my words, some shift in tone that hadn't quite emerged yet. "I've been thinking a lot lately about what family means, what sacrifice means, what theft means," I said. And now my mother's smile faltered slightly, and Emma's expression shifted to confusion. "About what it means when a parent takes something that doesn't belong to them, something that was meant to secure their child's future, and spends it on party decorations and flowers that will be dead in a week." The room went very quiet, and I saw understanding start to dawn on faces throughout the ballroom, saw Blake's mother lean forward in her seat with sudden sharp attention. 7 weeks ago, my mother emptied my college fund, $45,000 that my father set aside before he died, money he specifically intended for my education at Columbia University, where I had already been accepted to the journalism program, and she took every penny of it to pay for this wedding. I heard gasps ripple through the room and saw Emma's face turn deep red and watched my mother push back her chair and stand up with her mouth open. Mom, I want to thank you for teaching me exactly who I can trust, which is to say, no one in this family, and for showing me that my dreams and my future meant less to you than crystal chandeliers and designer wedding gowns, I said. And my mother was trying to speak now, but no sound was coming out, and Emma was shaking her head and saying something I couldn't hear over the ringing silence in the ballroom. My mother was moving toward me now with her hand outstretched like she could physically take back the microphone and stop the words that were already spreading through the room like wildfire, and Emma was half standing at the head table with tears streaming down her face, while Blake stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and I took 2 steps backward to keep the distance between us, while I continued speaking because I wasn't finished, not even close. I was accepted to Columbia University's journalism program for the spring semester, I said clearly into the microphone, and my voice didn't shake even though I could feel my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone might be able to hear it. I had been planning for this for years, working 2 jobs while taking classes at community college, maintaining a 4.0 GPA, doing everything right. And when I turned 22, that college fund my father set aside was supposed to let me finally transfer and finish my degree at the school I'd dreamed about since I was 15 years old. I saw Blake's mother lean over and whisper something urgent to Blake's father, whose face had gone hard with what looked like anger. And several guests had their phones out now, and I knew they were recording, but I didn't care, because I wanted this documented, wanted proof that I had finally told the truth after years of swallowing it down. But I lost that spot, temporarily at least, because I couldn't pay the deposit or the first semester's tuition, because the money was gone, spent on things like those chandeliers, and this 7-tier cake, and the ice sculpture that's melting by the bar. And when I confronted my mother about it, she told me that Emma's wedding was once in a lifetime, but I could always go to community college, as if my education and my future and my dead father's final gift to me were worth less than one party. My mother was shouting now, saying something about how I was being dramatic and manipulative and ruining everything. But her voice was competing with mine through the sound system, and most people were watching me instead of her, and I could see in their faces that they were doing the math, understanding exactly what had happened and what kind of person would do such a thing to their own child. My father died of cancer when I was 15 years old, I continued, and now I pulled my phone from where I'd tucked it into my dress and opened it to the photos I'd saved of his letters, the ones Richard had given me weeks ago. Before he died, he wrote me letters because he saw even then how our mother treated Emma and me differently, and he wanted me to know that he believed in me and that he'd made sure I would have resources to build my future, no matter what happened. I started reading from the letter on my phone screen. My father's words written 7 years ago but still so achingly present. Sarah, you have a strength and intelligence that will take you far in this world. I've set aside money for your education because I know you'll use it to do something meaningful. Never let anyone convince you that you're worth less than you are. My voice broke slightly on those last words, but I steadied it and looked up to see that several people were openly crying now, and Emma had buried her face in her hands while Blake sat frozen beside her, and my mother had stopped shouting and was just standing there with her mouth opening and closing like a fish. That's what my father wanted for me, what he died believing would happen, I said. And my mother took it and spent it on decorations and catering and an open bar. Took $45,000 that belonged to me and treated it like it was hers to spend on party favors and valet parking. And when I objected, she called me selfish and ungrateful and told me I should be happy for my sister. I looked out at 200 faces staring back at me in this $63,000 ballroom, and I felt something like peace settle over me as I prepared to say the words that would change everything. The truth I had been carrying in secret for weeks while I smiled and nodded and played my role as the grateful lesser sister. But here's what my mother doesn't know, I said into the microphone, and I saw her face shift from anger to confusion and then to something that might have been fear. My father didn't trust that one fund would be enough to protect my future, and it turns out he was right not to trust the people who were supposed to love me because he set up a second trust that matured when I turned 22, $78,000 that my mother never knew existed and never could touch, no matter how many emergency clauses she tried to exploit. The room erupted in murmurs, and I saw Emma's mouth fall open, and my mother actually stumbled backward like I had physically struck her. So I want to announce to everyone here that in 3 days I'm moving to New York City, where I have a small apartment in Washington Heights waiting for me. And in 2 weeks I'll be starting my spring semester at Columbia University's journalism program, where I was accepted months ago and where I'll be pursuing my degree exactly as my father intended, using the money he protected from the people who would have stolen that from me too, if they'd known it existed. I saw Kate stand up at table 5 and start clapping, and several other people joined her uncertainly, while my mother was shaking her head and saying, "No, no, no," like she could rewind time and undo what I had just revealed. I want to thank everyone here for bearing witness to this moment, and to the reasons why I'm cutting my mother and sister completely out of my life, effective immediately. And I want to be very clear that this isn't revenge or punishment, or even anger anymore. This is just me finally telling the truth and setting the boundaries I should have set years ago when it first became obvious that my family saw me as less valuable than party decorations and wedding cakes. I looked directly at my mother and then at Emma and felt nothing but a strange, hollow relief. I hope you enjoy your wedding and your marriage and your life together as mother and golden child, and I hope someday you understand what you did and what you lost. But I won't be waiting around to find out, because I have a future to build and a father's faith to honor, and I'm done letting you make me feel small. I set the microphone down on the nearest table, and the sound system gave a small feedback whine, and then I turned and walked toward the ballroom exit, while behind me the room exploded into chaos, voices rising in shock and outrage and confusion, and I heard my mother screaming my name and Emma sobbing, and Blake's father saying something in a loud, angry voice about character and theft. I didn't turn around. I kept walking past tables where people were standing now, some reaching out to touch my arm as I passed, and I heard fragments of conversation. An older woman saying good for her, and a man's voice saying, "I can't believe the mother would do that," and someone else saying, "Did you know about this?" Kate caught up with me near the door and grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard and said, "You were magnificent," with tears in her eyes, and I squeezed back, but kept moving because I needed to get outside before the adrenaline wore off and the reality of what I had just done caught up with me. Behind me, I could hear my mother's voice rising above the chaos, shouting something about lies and manipulation, and how could I do this to my sister, and I pushed through the heavy ballroom doors into the hotel corridor where the sound became muffled and distant, like it was happening in another world entirely. I made it maybe 20 feet down the hotel corridor before I heard the ballroom doors slam open behind me, and my mother's voice cutting through the air like a knife, screaming my name with a hysteria I had never heard from her before, and I didn't turn around, but I could hear her heels clicking rapidly on the marble floor as she chased after me with Emma's higher-pitched sobs, joining the cacophony of sound that followed me toward the elevator bank. I pressed the button and watched the numbers descend with agonizing slowness, while behind me my mother was shouting about how I had ruined everything. How could I be so cruel? How ungrateful and selfish and vindictive I was to destroy my sister's wedding day with lies and manipulation. And I turned finally to face them both as they caught up to me, my mother's carefully styled hair coming loose from its updo, and Emma's face blotchy and red with tears that were streaming down and taking her makeup with them. "Those weren't lies," I said quietly, and my voice sounded calm even though my hands were shaking at my sides. "Every single thing I said in there was the truth, and you both know it." My mother looked like she wanted to hit me, her hand actually raising slightly before she caught herself, and instead jabbed her finger toward my face. "You ungrateful little bitch," she hissed, and I saw several people who had followed us out of the ballroom stop and stare. After everything I've done for you, after I raised you and fed you and kept a roof over your head, this is how you repay me? By humiliating your sister and me in front of 200 people on the most important day of her life? I felt something cold settle in my chest. That same hollow feeling I had experienced so many times before when I realized that nothing I said would ever make her understand or acknowledge what she had done. You stole $45,000 from me, I said clearly. You stole my father's final gift, and you spent it on party decorations. And when I objected, you called me selfish. I didn't ruin Emma's wedding. I just finally told the truth about who you both really are. Emma lurched forward, and I saw her hand coming, but I was too stunned to move away before her palm connected with my cheek, the crack of the slap echoing in the corridor, and my face suddenly burning with the impact. I stood there touching my cheek and looking at my sister who was breathing hard and crying and saying, "You're jealous. You've always been jealous. You can't stand that I'm happy and successful and you're nothing." I felt something break inside me, but it wasn't pain. It was the final thread of connection that had still tied me to these people who shared my blood, but had never truly been my family. "I'm not jealous," I said softly, and I realized I was looking at her with sadness instead of anger. "I'm just done." Behind Emma and my mother, I saw Blake pushing through the crowd that had gathered, his face white and shocked, and behind him were his parents, his father's expression thunderous, and his mother's lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Is it true?" Blake asked, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. "Sarah, is what you said in there actually true? Your mother took your college fund to pay for our wedding?" Emma whirled to face him with her hand still raised like she might slap me again. "It was my mother's money to use how she wanted," she said shrilly. "Sarah's being dramatic. It wasn't that big a deal. She can still go to college later." Blake stared at his new wife like he had never seen her before, and his father stepped forward with the commanding presence of someone who had spent decades on the bench passing judgment. "That was not your mother's money," Blake's father said, and his voice carried the weight of decades spent in courtrooms, making pronouncements that people had no choice but to hear. "That was your daughter's inheritance from her deceased father, held in trust specifically for her education, and what you did is called conversion of funds, and it's legally actionable, not to mention morally reprehensible." My mother's face went pale and then flushed red, and she opened her mouth to argue, but Blake's mother cut her off with a voice that was somehow more terrifying for being quiet and controlled, the kind of voice that made students sit up straight in lecture halls. "We contributed $30,000 toward this wedding," she said, looking at my mother and Emma like they were specimens under glass. $30,000 that we now deeply regret spending, because if we had known that the bride's family had stolen from their own daughter to fund this spectacle, we would never have participated in rewarding such unconscionable behavior. I saw Emma reach for Blake's arm, but he stepped away from her, and that small movement said more than any words could have, and I watched my sister's face crumple as she realized that the fairy tale wedding she had demanded was turning into a nightmare that she couldn't control or cry her way out of. Blake was staring at Emma with an expression I had never seen him wear before, something between disgust and profound disappointment. "You knew," he said, "and it wasn't a question. Sarah told you what your mother did, and you not only didn't care, you made jokes about it at the rehearsal dinner, you publicly mocked her for having her future stolen." Emma was sobbing now, reaching for him again. "It wasn't like that. She's making it sound worse than it was. My mother had the right to access that money for family emergencies." Blake's father made a sound of contempt. "A wedding is not an emergency, it's a choice, and your mother committed what amounts to theft from a vulnerable family member who had already lost her father." He turned to look at me, and his expression softened slightly. "Sarah, I want you to know that if you choose to pursue legal action to recover those funds, I know several excellent attorneys who would be happy to take your case, and I would be willing to testify about what I witnessed here tonight if needed." I felt Kate slip her hand into mine and squeeze, and when I looked at her, she was crying but smiling at the same time. "You don't have to be alone in this," she said quietly. "I know we just met a few weeks ago, but I recognize courage when I see it. And what you did in there took more strength than anything I've ever witnessed." Around us, a small crowd had gathered in the hotel corridor, maybe 20 people who had followed the drama out of the ballroom, and I recognized some of them as extended family members I barely knew, cousins and aunts and uncles who had always been more Emma's relatives than mine, because my mother had made sure to maintain those relationships primarily through her golden child. An older woman I thought might be my father's sister stepped forward and said, "Your father would be so proud of you, Sarah, and so ashamed of what his wife became." And my mother whirled on her with fury, but the woman didn't back down, just stared back with steely resolve. I left the hotel that night knowing I could never go back, and I drove directly to my best friend Jenna's apartment, where I had already arranged to stay for the next 3 days until my move to New York. My car packed with the essentials I had smuggled out over the past week in preparation for exactly this scenario, because some part of me had known that my mother would retaliate in whatever way she could. When I pulled up to the house at midnight to get the last of my things, I found that she had already changed the locks, and I stood there on the front porch of the house where I had grown up, and felt absolutely nothing except a grim satisfaction that she was so predictable, that even in this final act of cruelty, she was simply confirming everything I had said about who she really was. I had my important documents already secured at Jenna's place: my birth certificate, my social security card, my passport, my father's letters. So there was nothing in that house that I actually needed, just clothes and books and photographs that I realized I didn't want anyway, because they were all contaminated with memories of being overlooked and dismissed and told I wasn't enough. My phone started buzzing before I even got back to the car, text after text lighting up the screen, and when I looked, I saw they were from my mother and Emma. A barrage of messages that alternated between fury and guilt-tripping and demands that I apologize for what I had done, how I had humiliated them, how I had destroyed Emma's wedding and her marriage before it even began. My mother's texts called me ungrateful and vindictive and cruel, said I had always been jealous of Emma and had finally found a way to hurt her, said that I was no longer welcome in her home or her life until I apologized and made this right. Emma's messages were more desperate, accusing me of ruining everything she had worked for, saying that Blake's parents hated her now, and Blake wouldn't even look at her, and it was all my fault for being so selfish and making everything about me, even on her wedding day. I sat in Jenna's driveway reading through the messages with a strange sense of detachment, and then I blocked both of their numbers and felt a weight lift from my chest that I hadn't even known I was carrying. Over the next 2 days, my phone filled with messages from extended family members, cousins and aunts and uncles I barely knew, and they were divided almost exactly down the middle, half of them supporting me and saying they had always suspected my mother favored Emma but hadn't realized how bad it was, and the other half condemning me for making a scene at a wedding regardless of the circumstances, saying that family problems should be handled privately, and I had been cruel and attention-seeking. I responded to the supportive messages with brief thanks and ignored the critical ones entirely, because I was done explaining myself to people who had watched me be mistreated for years and said nothing until I finally defended myself. Richard called me on the second day and said he was proud of me, that my father would have been proud of me, and that if I needed anything at all, I should call him immediately because he considered it his duty to look after me the way my father would have wanted. His voice cracked slightly when he said it, and I realized he was crying, and I thanked him and told him I was going to be okay, that I was actually going to be better than okay, because for the first time in 7 years, I felt like I could breathe. On the morning of the third day, I packed up Jenna's car and my car and started the drive to New York, and as I crossed the state line, I felt something shift inside me, like I was shedding a skin that had never quite fit right, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was never coming back. I found out about the videos 2 days after I arrived at Jenna's apartment, when my phone started lighting up with notifications from people I barely knew. And when I finally looked, I saw that at least 5 different guests had recorded my speech at the reception and posted it online. Some to Facebook and others to Twitter, and one to TikTok, where it had already been viewed 40,000 times and was climbing. I watched one of the videos with a strange sense of detachment, seeing myself on that small screen holding the microphone with my bridesmaid dress still perfect and my voice steady as I told 200 people exactly what my mother and sister had done. And in the comments section below, there were thousands of responses from people calling my mother a narcissist, and Emma a spoiled brat, and me brave and strong and justified in everything I had said. The video spread from social media to local news within 36 hours, and I woke up on my third morning at Jenna's to find that a reporter from our hometown newspaper had written a human interest piece titled "College Fund Theft Exposed at Wedding Reception" that detailed everything I had revealed and included quotes from unnamed guests who had witnessed the confrontation, and the article was being shared hundreds of times across multiple platforms. I didn't engage with any of it, didn't comment or share or respond to the dozens of messages from strangers offering support or asking for interviews, but I didn't hide from it either. Just let it exist as documentation of the truth I had finally spoken. Emma's social media accounts had been filled with carefully curated wedding photos showing her perfect dress and perfect flowers and perfect venue, each image captioned with something about dreams coming true or fairy tale endings. But within hours of the video's surfacing, her comment sections had been flooded with people asking if she felt good about stealing from her sister, and whether her marriage was built on money taken from a dead man's daughter, and if she had any shame at all. She tried to delete comments at first, spent what must have been hours blocking people and removing their words, but they kept coming faster than she could control them, and eventually she made all of her accounts private and disappeared from public view entirely. My mother's Facebook page became a battleground where her friends divided into camps, some defending her with comments about how parents have the right to make financial decisions for their families, and how I should have handled this privately instead of humiliating my sister, and others expressing shock and disappointment and saying they had always thought she was such a devoted mother, but clearly they had only ever seen what she wanted them to see. I watched it all unfold from a distance, checking in periodically the way you might observe a storm from a safe shelter, and I felt nothing except a vague curiosity about how far the ripples would spread. What I hadn't anticipated was that Blake's family's social standing would amplify everything exponentially. Because his father was a respected retired judge and his mother was a tenured professor, and they moved in circles where reputation mattered enormously, and within their community, the story spread like wildfire until Emma found herself not just socially embarrassed, but actively shunned by the very people she had been so eager to impress. I arrived in New York on a Tuesday morning in early December with everything I owned packed into my car and Jenna's car, 2 vehicles driving in tandem up I-95 because she had insisted on helping me move and staying for 2 days to make sure I was settled. And when I pulled up to the narrow 5-story building in Washington Heights and saw the tiny apartment that would be mine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember: pure, uncomplicated possibility. The apartment was a 4th-floor walk-up, just a studio with a kitchenette and a bathroom the size of a closet, maybe 300 square feet total, with a window that looked out at the brick wall of the building next door. But it was mine in a way that nothing had ever been mine before, paid for with my father's money that he had protected specifically so I could have this exact freedom. I spent the first week unpacking my limited belongings and buying essentials from Target and IKEA, stretching my father's fund as carefully as I could because I understood that this money was finite and precious and had to last me through 4 years of school, and I set up a detailed budget that tracked every dollar and made sure I was working 20 hours a week remotely for the legal transcription company that had agreed to keep me on after my move. Columbia's spring semester didn't start for another 2 weeks, so I had time to learn the subway system and find the cheapest grocery stores and locate the campus buildings where my classes would be held. And I walked through Columbia's gates for the first time on a Friday afternoon and stood there looking at the classical architecture and the students hurrying past with their backpacks and coffee cups, and felt tears sliding down my face because I was actually here. I had actually made it, despite everything my mother and sister had done to prevent it. Kate called me during my first week and asked if she could visit on Saturday. And when she arrived, she brought a box of housewarming gifts, nice dish towels and a small plant, and a framed print for my wall and expensive coffee that I would never have bought myself. And we sat on my floor because I only had one folding chair and drank that coffee while she told me what I had already begun to suspect, which was that Blake and Emma's marriage was falling apart before it had really even begun. Blake was horrified by what he had learned about Emma's character and her complicity in the theft, Kate said. And every time he looked at his wife, he saw someone who had watched her mother steal from her grieving sister and had felt no remorse, who had benefited from that theft and celebrated it and mocked me publicly for being the victim of it. And he couldn't reconcile the woman he thought he had married with the reality of who she actually was. Emma had been calling Kate constantly, Kate told me, crying and begging for help and convincing Blake to forgive her and move past it. But Kate had refused because she had watched how my family treated me throughout all the wedding events, and she couldn't unsee it. And besides, she liked me better than she had ever liked Emma anyway. We talked for 3 hours that day, and exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch. And Kate became one of my first real friends in New York, someone who knew my whole story and liked me not despite it, but including it. All of it. The mess and the pain and the vindication. I started therapy the second week, finding a sliding scale counselor through Columbia's student services who specialized in family trauma, and in our first session when she asked me why I was there, I said I needed to process 22 years of being told I didn't matter, and she nodded and said we would work on that together, and for the first time I believed that healing might actually be possible. 3 months into the spring semester, I walked across Columbia's campus with my backpack full of textbooks and my laptop and the notes for an article I was writing for my Introduction to Journalism seminar. And I realized with a jolt of recognition that I was genuinely happy, not the performative happiness I had tried to manufacture for my mother and sister, but the real kind that lives quietly beneath your ribs and colors everything you see. My grades were excellent. A 3.9 GPA after my first semester with an A- in statistics being the only thing that kept me from a perfect 4.0, and I had landed an internship at a small online publication called The Harbor Press that focused on investigative journalism and human interest stories, where I spent 15 hours a week fact-checking articles and learning the mechanics of real reporting from editors who treated me like a colleague rather than just a student. I had made friends too, actual friends who knew nothing about my family drama or the viral wedding speech or any of the pain that had brought me to New York, people who liked me simply because of who I was in their presence. And we studied together at Butler Library and got dollar pizza at 2 in the morning and argued about politics and storytelling craft in ways that made me feel intellectually alive for the first time in years. I was writing again, really writing, processing my experience through the lens of journalism by working on a long-form essay about family scapegoating dynamics and financial abuse that my advanced composition professor had encouraged me to develop. And the act of transforming my pain into something structured and purposeful felt like the best kind of alchemy. The email from Blake arrived on a Wednesday in late March, his name in my inbox startling me because I hadn't heard from him directly since the wedding. And when I opened it, I found 3 paragraphs written in the careful language of someone who had spent a long time choosing his words. He and Emma were separating, he wrote, and while Emma had blamed me for ruining their marriage by making that speech and exposing truths that should have stayed private, he wanted me to know that he was grateful I had shown him who he had actually married before they had brought children into a relationship built on foundations he couldn't respect. He said he kept thinking about how his wife had watched her mother steal from her grieving sister and had felt no remorse, how she had benefited from that theft and celebrated it, and mocked me for being its victim. And every time he tried to move past it, he found himself unable to trust the person sleeping next to him, or imagine building a life with someone whose moral compass was so fundamentally broken. He apologized for not speaking up sooner, for not defending me more forcefully in the parking lot, and he wished me well at Columbia, and said he hoped I was thriving. I read the email twice, and then closed my laptop and sat in my tiny apartment feeling a complicated mixture of vindication and sadness, because I had never wanted to destroy Emma's marriage, but I also couldn't regret telling the truth that had allowed Blake to see clearly who he had legally bound himself to. My mother attempted to reach out during this same period, not directly because I had blocked her number and email, but through various relatives who suddenly started contacting me with messages about how she missed me and wanted to reconcile and hoped we could move past our disagreement, as though she had simply forgotten to water my plants rather than stolen my future. And every single message carried the same underlying expectation that I would be the one to apologize for making a scene at Emma's wedding instead of handling things privately, like a mature adult. I didn't respond to any of them. 6 months after Emma's wedding, I received an email from an editor at The Atlantic named Jennifer Hirsch, who had seen my essay about family scapegoating dynamics that I had written for my advanced composition class, and that my professor had encouraged me to submit to her contacts in the publishing world. And she asked if I would be interested in expanding it into a full-length piece for their family section about financial abuse and the particular cruelty of parental theft from children who have already lost one parent, with a focus on how these dynamics play out and what recovery looks like. I said yes immediately and spent 3 weeks writing and revising, pouring everything I had learned in therapy and everything I had processed through journalism training into 4,000 words that felt like the truest thing I had ever written, an essay that honored my father's protection and foresight while unflinchingly examining my mother's cruelty and my sister's complicity, and my own journey from victim to survivor to someone who had built an entirely new life on the foundation of one good parent's love. The essay published in late September with the title The Inheritance My Mother Stole and the One She Couldn't Touch, and it went viral within hours, shared thousands of times across social media with comments from people who recognized their own family dynamics in my story, and my inbox filled with messages from other scapegoated children and stolen from siblings and people who had survived their own versions of being erased by the people who should have protected them. I read every single message and responded to as many as I could, feeling the strange weight of having transformed my private pain into something public and communal, something that helped other people feel less alone in their own justified anger and hard-won freedom. My mother sent one final email 3 days after the essay published. Not to my blocked address, but to a public contact form on the Atlantic's website that got forwarded to me, and in it she said she was hurt that I had aired our private family business to the entire world, that she had always done her best as a single mother raising 2 daughters, and that she hoped someday I would understand the impossible choices parents have to make, and find it in my heart to forgive her. But nowhere in those 4 paragraphs did she acknowledge what she had actually done, or offer any real apology, or take any genuine accountability for stealing $45,000 that my father had set aside specifically to protect me from exactly the kind of favoritism she had always shown Emma. I read it once and then deleted it and felt nothing but relief that I had been right to cut contact, that some people will never be capable of the self-examination that real reconciliation requires. On a cold Saturday in October, I took the Metro North up to the cemetery in Westchester where my father was buried, a trip I had been planning since the essay published because I wanted to tell him in person about everything that had happened, and I sat on the grass next to his headstone with my coat pulled tight against the wind and told him about Columbia and my internship and my essay and the life I had built with the money he had protected for me, and I thanked him for seeing me clearly enough to know I would need resources independent of my mother, for loving me enough to ensure I would have a future even after he was gone. I told him I understood now that my worth had never been dependent on my mother's recognition, that he had seen my value, and that was enough, that I carried his faith in me like a light in my chest that nothing could extinguish. When I got back to the city that evening, I went straight to Columbia's journalism building, even though it was Saturday and I didn't have work to do there, and I climbed to the fifth floor, where the large windows overlooked the campus and the buildings beyond, and the lights of the city spreading out toward the horizon, and I stood there with my manuscript pages in hand and my father's voice in my memory, and genuine happiness rising in my throat like song. And I smiled at my reflection in the dark glass, because I had done it. I had actually done it. I had survived and escaped and built something real and good from the wreckage of my mother's cruelty, and I was free.